Recently, there's been a massive surge in employee activism, with workers taking some of the world's biggest companies to task on a range of issues. In 2018, thousands of Google employees around the world walked out to protest their employer's handling of sexual harassment claims. Employees at tech giants like Amazon and Microsoft have posted letters on Medium or signed internal petitions about companies' government-related work, or questioning how their technologies are being used. Employee activism goes beyond the tech sector, though. Deloitte and McKinsey & Company have both come under pressure from employees to end their work with U.S. immigration and customs enforcement. Social activism isn't just for the rank and file. More and more CEOs are using their leadership position as a platform for discussing social issues. From AT&T and Dick's Sporting Goods to Merck and Goldman Sachs, Vox reports leaders at a wide range of businesses have spoken out on social issues and weighed in on political controversies. Today on the Internal Comms Procast, learn what can happen when employees use internal channels and tools to activate change, and what it means for the future of your workplace. Employee activism, what it is, how to manage it, and why it isn't always a bad thing.
I think one of the important pieces that people need to think about in employee activism, we have a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh my gosh, this is not a good thing, or this is a conflict. And I think there can be both very positive and more challenging pieces of employee activism.
The Internal Comms Procast is sponsored by Circle. Circle gives you a 10,000-foot view of the engagement of your organization. But that's just the beginning. Circle Insights allow you to zoom in and measure the pulse and engagement of each location, division, or person. Easily create and share reports with stakeholders to show off your amazingness. Request a demo at circle.com. That's CERKL.com. Welcome to the Internal Comms Procast. I am your host, Barry Williams. Let's meet today's guest.
So my name is Sharon McIntosh, and I run my own firm called And Then Communications, which is 100% focused on employee communications and change management. So I really came kicking and screaming into internal communications. I was previously doing media relations, and I didn't want to go into internal communications. It felt like it was a step back in my career. And as most internal communications folks have found, once you get into internal communications, you fall in love. And that's exactly what happened with me. I took like 2 years as a sidestep into marketing. And as soon as I got into marketing, I said, you know what, I just miss internal communications so much. And I ended up coming back to it. So I did internal communications at Waste Management, at Sears, and at PepsiCo.
With more than 2 decades of communications experience, Sharon has a passion for creating and executing new ideas to drive employee engagement at Fortune 500 companies. One issue Sharon enjoys educating communicators on is employee activism. So, who are employee activists? And what drives them to take a stand? Sharon explains.
So, employee activism, I say, are the 3 V's. So, it's about being vocal, and these are employees who you definitely can hear them. If you've been watching in the press, you can hear that they're more than willing to talk to the press. That's leads to the second V, which is that they're visible. And this is something new to internal communications folks, that most of our employees in the past have wanted to be anonymous. And now they're stepping forward and willing to actually put their names in front of their cause. That leads us to our third V, which is about being value-based. So they're looking at their personal values, looking at their companies and saying, do these values match up? And if they don't, they're going to their companies as a group and saying, we need to see change. Part of it certainly is millennials getting far more involved in the workplace. And as we've been seeing this trend, which is kind of, the employee activism piece is following this concept of employees wanting to join a purpose-driven company. And I was reading some stat the other day that said of millennials, and those are, between the ages of 22 to 37, would consider taking a pay cut 86% of them would consider taking a pay cut at a company whose mission and values align with their own. And by comparison, only 9% of baby boomers said the same thing. So I think this purpose-driven piece is really what is driving it. The second piece that has come to light is the Edelman Trust Barometer. And the number one piece that employees said is that they are looking to their employer as being the most trusted. So the expectations of companies is increasing. And again, employees are starting to say, you know what, I want to go work for a values-based company, and I need that company to really match up with my personal values. I think one of the important pieces that people need to think about in employee activism, we have a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh my gosh, this is not a good thing, or this is a conflict. And I think there can be both very positive and more challenging pieces of employee activism. So I'll give you the example. At PepsiCo, we had about 5,000 employee ambassadors. That, in my mind, is employee activism. That is something that we worked together to activate employees and to talk about the company. The conflict piece is starting to sort of highlight a little bit more, because what we're seeing is that employees are looking at their own values and looking at social issues such as climate change, such as raising the issue around sexual harassment or pay inequity. And just like you and me, we're finding this personal passion if it hits a personal value.
The kind of employee activism that keeps communicators up at night deals with sensitive topics like pay, discrimination, and business practices. As an Internal Comms Pro, you are in a unique position in your organization. You serve as the connective tissue between every department and location inside your company. When you begin hearing rumblings of activation on the part of your employees against the policies or practices of your employer, it may be tempting to ignore the activists or to shut down the channels where the chatter is taking place. Sharon says that you could be making the situation worse.
So I think most companies that have failed and will fail take more of a command and control strategy to this. I'll give you a Google example. So last fall, the New York Times published an expose which revealed payouts to several accused of sexual misconduct. The next day, Google held its regularly scheduled, what they call a TGIF meeting, to answer employee questions. And they didn't address it at the meeting. And employees were mad. They didn't address it until the employees actually brought it up during the Q&A period. So I think if there's some type of major issue, if you have an issue that is in the New York Times, you need to address that immediately up front. I think it's also, if you try to clamp things down, if you say, oh gosh, look at all the negative things that are happening on our internet, people are starting to increase negative comments, we're just going to shut that down and then ignore it. You're gonna end up with something that's going to be ready to explode. So I think, again, back to, I know it's so basic, but just back to making sure you're listening to the organization, listening to your employees, and also that you're doing this on an ongoing basis. If you as an internal communicator are doing a really good job of staying ahead of all these different topics, things shouldn't surprise you too much because you've had your ear to the ground. If you haven't been listening, it's going to be much tougher to kind of predict what some of the topics and passions that are sitting there with employees that are about to come forward.
So, you may need to be the one to alert leadership of a potential activism incident. Here's how Sharon suggests you prepare.
So, if you are sitting down with leadership to sort of talk through this, first of all, just like you do in any leadership conversation, make sure you have your data. If you have any type of activation that's been happening both internally or externally, have the numbers handy so you can scale on whether this is a smaller issue a larger issue or a smaller issue that you think will become a larger issue. So therefore you need to start with it. So have your data ready. I think also have both points of view or the multiple points of view that are being brought forward. So here's what the company is saying. Here's what the employees are saying. And this kind of vocal group of employees are saying, and here might be some other surveying or other data that you're bringing through that the majority of the employees are saying. So again, to understand, is this a megaphone for understanding what's happening in the broader organization, or is this a smaller group of people that you just really need to sit down and talk to that's more of a minority group? So I think your leadership's going to want to know kind of all viewpoints. And then obviously you should have a point of view or a recommendation on how to approach that. And then what's your plan? What's your suggested plan to bring forward?
Sharon says that the plan for leadership should come from your crisis plan section on employee activism. Yes, we just added another section to your crisis plan. Working through and practicing possible scenarios before they happen can help you keep your strategy front and center during trying times. But what if something pops up while you're still working on your plan? Sharon has some advice.
So the first thing I would look at is, and again, going back to the fact that usually these employees want to be visible. So you're going to start to see leaders in this discussion, and to start identifying those leaders. And the absolute first thing we need to do, and we need to do this in everything that we do in internal communications, but particularly in this case, is listen. We don't just try to shut them down. We don't try to push the conversation away. We need to sit and listen to the employees. The second thing I would suggest is if the issue is bubbling up on your internal channels, and sometimes that's where it starts. If you have commenting, if you have social media, internal social media such as Yammer, and you're seeing them form groups, do your best to get those conversations offline, just like you would in any sort of social media crisis. Get that conversation offline so you can have one-on-one conversations. Then I think it's up to the company. I think it's up to your leadership. Do you want to take that information? Do you want to make a change, or do you not? So that's when it becomes a little bit tougher, that you need to either decide whether you're going to bring those employee activists into the conversation, and I think that should be an option, or if it's going to be, hey, here's something that happened at the company, they're activating against it, and then you need to have the listening conversations and help them understand the company viewpoints. Again, I think that listening piece, the leadership getting involved when they need to. I don't think they need to get involved in every single employee activism piece, but if it starts to escalate something that's that external, they should be stepping up to the plate. One more I think is really important was identifying your employee ambassadors, again, before a crisis hits. So the fact that at PepsiCo, when we had these 5,000 ambassadors, if we had a crisis scenario, we would go to them first and we would talk to them. We would explain our point of view and say, hey, please explain this point of view to your colleagues as well. And we had already established that trust with those employees, and they were often, it just comes so much better when you're hearing from a colleague than even from management about, hey, this is how I heard the information, this is how I understand it, and explaining it to a fellow colleague.
Once the resolution is given, it may be tempting to move on to the next thing. Sharon warns that your work isn't done.
I would make sure if there is an employee who has been a leader and an employee activist, I would keep that person or persons very close. I would bring them into conversations. I would get their feedback. I would take them out to lunch. I don't think that these always have to be a negative thing. I think they can sometimes be a very positive thing, because the fact is the employees, if they're activating, they're engaged. So, this is something we've been asking for all along, is employee engagement. Well, folks, here it is. And sometimes it's not in the form that necessarily we like because it's not as controlled. but this is employee engagement.
One way to give your organization a little insulation from possibly negative employee activism is to make your company's values a living, breathing thing. Sharon says it might be time to revisit your values to be sure they align with your current mission and leadership.
Going back to your values, I also am recommending to all my clients, a lot of times we create these values and they sit on a shelf somewhere. So go find your values, go dust them off and bring them forward, because the employee activist, I'll tell you this as well, and Google did it as well. They will look at those values and they will say, we're not abiding by those values. You're telling me one of the values is empowerment. I'm not feeling empowered. So make sure you're going back and looking at those values based, and that you're actually bringing those to life in your organization. I also would have a really good conversation with your CEO or whoever is head of your organization to know what he or she has on kind of their personal views, because the other person who's starting to activate are CEOs. So CEO activists are becoming far more visible. So you want to know, are the company values aligned with the leadership values, aligned with the employee values? And if you have all those three aligned, it gets really powerful. I mean, you look at a company like Patagonia, they actually have employee activists on their website where they're engaging in environmental issues, and it all just works beautifully. So I would say that's the main thing, is go back and look at those values. Make sure that you're dusting them off and activating them, and you're communicating against them.
We want to thank Sharon for sharing her experience with our listeners today. We are thrilled to have her be the keynote speaker at our June 27th Rise and Shine event in Chicago. The topic of this free morning of learning is Employee Power, Activists on Your Payroll. Register online at internalcommspro.com/shine. If you can't make it to Chicago, there are many ways to stay connected to Sharon and her work.
Sure, you can find more about And Then Communications on my website. It's andthencoms.com. Or I welcome anyone reaching out to me over LinkedIn. I do a monthly podcast called EE Voice with my co-host Sharon Phillips, and we discuss internal communications from a tactical standpoint about every other month, every month to every other month. And then on Twitter, you can reach me at McIntosh S.
Next time on the Internal Comms Procast, we welcome Lenovo's Erin Bergamo-Tacey. Erin will give advice to help you through the difficult task of communicating across countries and cultures. Learn what matters and what to let go of in your pursuit of the best communications for your entire global audience.
So first of all, I think with a global view, the biggest challenge is going to be understanding. I think we all have an innate desire to be experts in our field. And I think when you're building a global strategy, I say this to my team a lot, there is absolutely no way that you are going to be an expert in every single market in which we operate. There just isn't. And so you have to be okay with that.
Internal Comms Procast is produced by Super Awesome Media. Our executive producer is Rachel Foles. Connor Sweeney is our engineer, and Kelsey Rizzuto is our associate producer. Our theme music is Please Listen Carefully by Jazzer via the Free Music Archive. Our intro music is Sea of Glass by our audio engineer, Connor Sweeney. Show notes and more are available at internalcommspro.com.